Scott Joplin did a remarkable thing. He was the first African-American classical composer, if we understand his approach to music. Scott Joplin was the first African-American classical composer to use Afrocentric rhythm patterns, musical forms in his music in such a way that it could stand toe-to-toe with the classical music of the day. He wasn't the first African-American classical composer by a long shot, but he was the first one to incorporate Afrocentric melodic and musical forms in his music and make it acceptable. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very, very remarkable thing. If you think about how long it took for jazz and other Afrocentric forms to infiltrate classical music. Remember, Joplin died in 1917. It's a remarkable thing. So how did we go then from somebody of the stature of a Scott Joplin creating this? How did we wind up with this honky-tonk red light district barroom piano player guy made good? Where did we get that? How did we wind up with that as part of our popular mental picture? Think about that. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is where it gets interesting. And on that note, I'm going to end it. And I welcome your comments, suggestions, questions, whatever. And lights, if we have them. Thank you. Anybody? You're just so... Yeah, somebody way back in the back.
Thank you for that. I find that very interesting. Just to make sure I understand it properly, was the reason that Scott Joplin was able to get that music out into the broader musical world because of the publishing of it?
But because it was published, yes. He happened to come along, he was very aware of the potential that recording had to disseminate his music, in particular piano rolls. I have a hunch that, well, you have to understand how copyright worked when you start looking at the disseminating of music through pianos. Because typically, in the early 1900s, when a publisher purchased a piece of music, they published the entire rights to it outright, and as soon as the publisher owned it, the composer had no rights to it. They couldn't do anything else. The publisher had full control of it, including whether or not it was recorded onto a player piano. Now, Silver Swan Rag, which I assume you're familiar with, was the piece that only turned up on a piano roll. It would not surprise me if Joplin's selling of that piece to be made into a roll was to circumvent the copyright laws, because he knew that he could get his name, probably could get his name out to more people by selling it as a roll, and if he sold it to a publisher, then perhaps it might not make it. But if he sold it straight to a roll, then yeah, it was guaranteed to get out. So.
Sorry, which piece was that?
Silver Swan Rag.
So I have this idea in my head from various ragtime histories that there was a prior period in Joplin's life when he was traveling a lot as an itinerant piano player, and that this was where some of the other guys came up and said, well, actually, I wrote part of Make Me Brag, right? So was that, did he have an era like that in his life?
There was a period in his life that we really don't know about. We do know that he was a touring musician, but he was, what we know of that was that he was touring with an ensemble, the Texas Medley Quartet, which was actually a double quartet of mainly vocalists that would double on instruments from time to time. And in fact, the earliest published pieces we have were pieces that they performed. Okay. But as far as him, you know, sitting playing honky-tonks, we don't, or bars or whatever, we don't have any verifiable proof of that. We can't discount it. But we can verify that he was performing with this ensemble in various places in the mid-1890s. Before that, we simply don't know.
You mentioned before he got resettled in St. Louis, he was at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893.
Yes.
Where did he play at the World's Fair? Was it on the
Probably, well, he was not, African Americans were not allowed to participate in the 1893 World's Fair. Cough up a lung. However, there was, just outside the fair, a district, if you will, of nightclubs, theaters, all sorts of places. He probably was, and he may have participated in that sort of wide open environment there.
Well, we
We
don't know.
don't have any verifiable record of it. All we know is that he was there with the Texas Medley Quartet. Now, where they performed, we don't know. Probably in some unknown small venue in the Pike, that area just off the fairgrounds. But he wasn't apparently there by himself as a solo performer. He was performing with the Texas Medley Quartet. And the reason we know this is because we found newspaper accounts that they were coming back from the fair. Wow, there's a bench. So we know that they were there and he was part of it. We don't have a record of him being there as a solo piano player playing ragtime. We have him there as a member of the Texas Medley Quartet coming back. So it still raises some questions about him being this sort of ballroom pianist in that sort of environment.
Yeah, I just have some questions about his education and training. How much formal training did he have in music? I mean, he could read music, could he write? I mean,
He apparently could. The only verifiable evidence we have is that there was a gentleman named Julius Weiss, when the Joplin's parents, when the town of Texarkana was founded, the family moved into Texarkana. The founder of Texarkana had brought a tutor over from Germany for his daughter, and that tutor, Julius Weiss, wound up teaching Joplin at least music and probably other elements of European culture.
And there was the George Smith College.
There was the George Smith College. We know he was there. We know he was in Sedalia at the time. We have anecdotal accounts that he attended there. We have there, because of a fire that destroyed the college and the records, we have no verifiable evidence of what he did there. I've heard all sorts of speculation that he took advanced theory there, which probably wasn't offered. I've also heard it speculated that he may have taught there, which would almost make more sense. But we don't know what his connection to George Smith College was, other than he was there.
do we know if he actually did his own
He seems to have. There's no reason to believe he didn't. He was probably one of probably was the only, actually, of the triumvirate, if you will, of African American ragtime people. Turpin and Chauvin and Joplin was the only one that could write. Turpin could not. Chauvin could not.
Consider also he had a couple of arrangements for band published with Star.
Yes,
Like Frog Legs, for example.
Yes, he did some of the arrangements in the Redback Book. He did. He understood apparently very clearly how harmony works, how and probably through his work with the Texas Medley Quartet. If you understand how African American quartet singing works, think barbershop. If you understand how that works, you suddenly understand a lot better the almost contrapuntal structure of Joplin's music. So he was very clearly a very well educated, cultured African American musician. I wouldn't put him in a Hell's Half Acre environment. It doesn't fit him. It doesn't fit.
Do you need it anymore?
I don't.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't fit him. It doesn't fit the historical record of what the neighborhood was like. I could see, yeah, I see you have something cooking there, I could see.
Just two questions. One, you said Turpin and Siobhan, they didn't write. You mean write music or they were illiterate?
No, they did not write music.
Okay.
Turpin, everything that we have of his is arranged by somebody else. And Siobhan, the only things we have of his are stuff that he wrote with that other people wrote with him.
Artie Matthews did a lot of stuff
Yeah,
for Turpin.
yeah. Artie Matthews did, a whole bunch of people arranged Turpin stuff. But Turpin apparently couldn't write down, he could compose like nobody else, but he couldn't write down. And they had another question.
Yeah, during Joplin's time, were there prominent white ragtime performers? And if so, how accepting were they of Joplin's greatness or his status?
It's hard to say. The person that immediately comes to mind is Ben Harney. He
Mike.
was in New York, though.
Bernard.
Al Bernard.
Mike Bernard.
Mike Bernard. And there was a certain sense of they have to be faking. There was a certain they can't, this can't be real, you know, that we're the only ones that really know what music is, after all, because we're European and we're educated and we're stuffy. And these guys just have to be faking it, you know. It goes back to the whole sort of stereotype, if you will, that African Americans were, that any black guy could play music and he could just sit down and it was up to the white folks to sit down and write it down. Didn't work that way. But it was that stereotype, that line of thinking. And now there were white musicians in St. Louis that very clearly were fond of ragtime, that worked closely with ragtime composers. Most interesting, I think, is the guy forgive me if I mispronounce his name because I've heard about 5 different pronunciations of it. Delisle, D.S. David Socrates Delisle, however you say it. He arranged several of the early Turpin rags, wrote them down. He also did some of the arrangements of some of the Joplin pieces in the Redback Book, much later. He was an accomplished musician. In fact, he was the organist at the Catholic Cathedral, and then later at the college church that's part of St. Louis University. So here was somebody that was culturally and musically prominent in St. Louis, that was intimately familiar with ragtime. So there was a lot more racial interplay in St. Louis in the late 1890s and early 1900s than I think a lot of people want to give credit for. If that answers your question at all, I don't know. Yes?
I wonder if you could put your last slide up with I think the statement is a little too strong, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
If my memory is correct, and it may not be, around 1898, the Maple Leaf Triangle was written.
Yes.
But there was also U.B. Blake published the Charleston Rag.
He published Charleston Rag in 1899.
No,
But
1917.
1917, he published it. That's right.
It was written.
That's
He was 12
now,
years old in 1899.
Pardon?
He was 12 in 1899. He did not write
the
it.
critical difference.
Okay.
The critical difference is U.B. Blake, and I may be very wrong in this, but I don't think that U.B. Blake considered himself a classical musician. I don't think he had that approach to the music, that he was writing in a classical form, in a classical sense, in the way that Joplin was, by intending everything that he wrote down to be played as written. Now, there were African-American classical composers. William Grant Still is chief among them. He was writing classical music long before Joplin was published. But guess what? If you listen to that stuff, you wouldn't know that it was an African-American composer, because he sounds just as European as anybody else that was composing music at that time that was European. It wasn't until he wrote the first black show on Broadway, Clorinda, which I believe was after 1900, wasn't it? Something like that, 1901. That he started writing Afrocentric themes into his music, and he was dead.